On a rainy March night in 1980, a 14-year-old boy walked into the Ukiah, California, police station holding a 5-year-old child. He told the stunned officer that he himself had been kidnapped 7 years earlier, and the same man had just abducted this little boy. He said simply, "I brought him back." Before we go further into this story, please consider subscribing to Cold Case Whisperer. It's highly appreciated, and it helps us keep bringing you real cold case stories like this one. Timothy David White was 5 years old in February of 1980, a bright-eyed boy with sandy hair who lived with his mother, his stepfather, and his siblings in a modest house on Branscombe Road, a quiet street on the southern edge of Ukiah, a small city nestled in the coastal hills of Mendocino County. His family knew the neighborhood as safe, a place where children rode bicycles along the sidewalks and played in front yards until the streetlights flickered on. On the afternoon of February 14th, Valentine's Day, Timothy was doing exactly that, playing outside his home while his mother Angela checked on him from the window and tended to household chores. At around 5:30 in the evening, she glanced out and realized she could no longer see him. She stepped onto the porch and called his name. There was no answer. She searched the yard, then the neighbors' yards, then the street, her voice rising with a panic that every parent will recognize. Within minutes, the entire block was combing the area, and a call went out to the Ukiah Police Department. Timothy White had vanished without a sound, without a witness, without a single trace. The Valentine's Day abduction triggered an immediate and massive search. Officers knocked on every door, patrol cars cruised the surrounding roads, and volunteers fanned out into the brush and creek beds that threaded through the landscape. A photograph of Timothy, a smiling child with a cowlick and an open face, was circulated throughout Northern California. The case drew regional media attention, and the FBI was notified because of the possibility that the boy had been taken across state lines. But in those first critical hours, there were no credible sightings and no physical evidence left behind. It was as if the earth had simply opened and swallowed a 5-year-old child whole. What no one searching the streets of Ukiah could possibly have known was that Timothy White had not been taken by a stranger in the ordinary sense of the word, but by a predator who had been perfecting his method of abduction and concealment for nearly a decade. A man named Kenneth Eugene Parnell. Kenneth Parnell was 48 years old in 1980, a slight, unassuming man with a history of sexual violence against children and a trail of prison stints that had done nothing to alter his compulsions. He had been convicted of armed robbery and sexual offenses in the 1950s and 1960s, and by the early 1970s, he was drifting through California's Central Valley, working odd jobs and feeding a fantasy of owning a young boy he could raise as his own. On December 4th, 1972, Parnell parked his battered sedan outside an elementary school in the city of Merced, more than 300 miles from Ukiah, and offered a ride to a 7-year-old boy named Steven Stayner. Steven, a trusting child walking home in the winter twilight, was lured by the promise of a religious pamphlet and a picture of a puppy. Parnell drove him not to his home but to a remote cabin in the hills, and for the next several years Steven Stayner existed under the name Dennis Parnell, told that his parents had given him away, forced to call his captor Dad, and enrolled in a series of small rural schools under the guise of being Parnell's son. During those years, Parnell moved the boy from town to town, from Cathy's Valley to Camchi to Point Arena, always staying one step ahead of suspicion. By 1979, he had settled in a dilapidated house on or Springs Road, about 15 miles west of Ukiah, a property surrounded by dense woods and hidden from casual view. Steven Stayner, now 14 and growing into a tall, handsome teenager, had long since understood that he was a prisoner. He had been subjected to years of psychological manipulation and sexual abuse, but he had also learned to survive by reading his captor's moods and keeping his own thoughts carefully guarded. In the months leading up to Valentine's Day 1980, Parnell began to speak openly to Steven about finding a younger boy, a new companion, someone Steven could call a brother. Parnell's attentions were shifting, and Steven understood with a sick clarity that he was being asked to participate in the abduction of another child. For a long time, he stalled. But on February 14th, Parnell ordered the boy into a sedan and drove into Ukiah. They cruised the residential streets, and at some point Parnell spotted Timothy White playing alone in front of his house. Parnell stopped the car and instructed Steven to get out and tell the little boy that there was a lost puppy nearby and that he needed help finding it. Steven, who would later testify that he was terrified of what Parnell would do if he refused, walked over to the 5-year-old, spoke to him quietly, and coaxed him toward the waiting car. As soon as Timothy was within reach, Parnell pulled him into the back seat, shoved him down onto the floorboards, and sped away. Within minutes, Timothy White was inside the hidden house on or Springs Road, locked in a small bedroom with a single window and a bare bulb overhead. For the next 16 days, Timothy was held captive in that cramped room. He was sexually abused by Kenneth Parnell. He cried for his mother. He asked again and again when he could go home. Steven Stayner, who had been forced into the role of accomplice, was charged with watching the boy, feeding him, and keeping him quiet when Parnell was out of the house. In those 2 weeks, a strange and powerful bond formed between the two captives. Steven looked at Timothy and saw a reflection of his own stolen childhood. He knew exactly what the little boy was enduring, and the guilt of his own role in the abduction ate at him. He began to formulate a plan, fragile and terrifying, to get the child out of that house and back to his family. Steven knew that Parnell worked a night shift as a security guard at a lumber mill. He knew the pattern of the man's absences, and he understood that the nearest police station was in downtown Ukiah. On the evening of March 1st, 1980, 16 days after Timothy was taken, Parnell left for work just before 7 o'clock. Steven waited until the sound of the engine had faded into the damp Mendocino night. Then he moved. He dressed Timothy warmly against the rain, put a jacket over his own shoulders, and told the little boy that they were leaving, that he was taking him home. The two slipped out of the house and began walking down or Springs Road, a winding, narrow strip of asphalt cutting through the dark forest. The rain fell steadily, and the road was nearly empty. Steven carried Timothy for stretches when the child's legs grew tired. They walked for several miles before the headlights of a pickup truck appeared behind them. Steven stuck out his thumb, and the driver, a young man heading into town, pulled over and let the two boys climb into the cab. He asked no pressing questions, perhaps assuming they were brothers or neighbors in need of a ride. The driver dropped them near the center of Ukiah, just a few blocks from the police station. Steven hoisted Timothy onto his hip and walked through the front door of the station at approximately 9:30 that night. The officer at the desk, Sergeant Richard Warner, looked up to see a soaked teenage boy holding a small, frightened child. Steven Stayner spoke the words that would break the case wide open and become etched into the annals of true crime history. "My name is Steven Stayner. I was kidnapped 7 years ago. This is Timothy White. The same man took him. I brought him back." At that moment, the investigation that had stalled for more than 2 weeks was suddenly reignited with a force that no one could have predicted. If the quiet courage of a 14-year-old boy walking into a police station to return a stolen child strikes you as a story worth remembering, and if you believe these long-overlooked cases deserve a permanent place in our collective memory, we invite you to subscribe to this channel now and join us in bringing these true accounts to light. Within minutes of Steven Stayner's arrival, Ukiah police were on the line with the Merced Police Department, which confirmed the details of the 1972 abduction that had never been solved. Officers were dispatched to the White residence on Branscombe Road, where Angela White received the call every parent in her position prays for and dreads in equal measure. Her son was alive. He was safe. He was at the police station. The reunion that followed was, by all accounts, almost beyond words, a torrent of tears and tight embraces in the sterile light of the station lobby. While the family was being brought together, a team of officers was already en route to the house on War Springs Road. They searched the property and found a locked room containing a child's mattress, blankets, and a few toys, along with items that connected the space directly to Timothy White. Kenneth Parnell was arrested at his workplace in the early hours of March 2nd, still in his security guard uniform, and taken into custody without incident. At first, he denied any knowledge of the kidnapping. He claimed the boy in the room was a relative's child, but confronted with the testimony of both Steven and Timothy, and with the physical evidence inside the house, his story crumbled. Parnell was charged with multiple counts of kidnapping and false imprisonment. Because the statute of limitations had long since expired on the 1972 abduction of Steven Stayner, prosecutors focused the case on the kidnapping of Timothy White. Still, the horror of what Parnell had done over the course of nearly 8 years would be laid bare in court. The trial took place later in 1980, and it centered on the testimony of the two boys. Steven Stayner, soft-spoken but unwavering, described in detail how Parnell had directed him to lure Timothy, and how he himself had been held captive since childhood. His testimony was a masterclass in quiet resilience, a boy who had been robbed of his innocence explaining to a courtroom how he had finally drawn the line. Timothy White, too young to fully grasp the legal proceedings, was not required to testify at length, but his presence was felt keenly. Kenneth Parnell was convicted of kidnapping and false imprisonment. In early 1981, a Mendocino County judge sentenced him to a term of 7 years to life in state prison. The sentence, while substantial, would prove to be a source of deep public anger in the years that followed because of the realities of California's parole system at the time. Parnell was incarcerated at the California Men's Colony in San Luis Obispo. He served just over 5 years of that sentence. Despite objections from law enforcement and from the families whose lives he had shattered, Parnell was released on parole in 1985. He settled in the Bay Area, living in a series of halfway houses and low-rent apartments, required to register as a sex offender, but otherwise largely free to move about society. The outrage over his early release was palpable, but there was little that prosecutors could do under the laws as they then stood. Steven Stayner, meanwhile, was thrust into the national spotlight as a hero. He was reunited with his biological parents, Delbert and Kay Stayner, and his brother and sisters in Merced, a family that had never stopped hoping he was alive even as the years passed without a single clue. Adjusting to normal life after 7 years of captivity was, by Steven's own later admission, extraordinarily difficult. He had missed the formative experiences of childhood and adolescence, and he struggled with the sudden expectations of freedom. Yet he did his best. He returned to school, eventually married, and became a father to 2 children. He lived a quiet life in the Central Valley, working a series of jobs, and he rarely spoke publicly about the ordeal once the trial was over. When he did talk about it, he deflected praise, saying simply that any decent person would have done what he did. Timothy White went home to his family in Ukiah and resumed the normal life of a young boy, though the shadow of the abduction never fully lifted. His parents shielded him from the media glare as much as possible, allowing him to grow up in relative privacy. The White family and the Stayner family maintained a quiet connection in the years that followed, bound together by the extraordinary events of that winter. Timothy grew into a thoughtful young man. He eventually moved to Southern California, where he pursued a career in law enforcement, working as a sheriff's deputy in San Bernardino County. He married and had children of his own, building a life dedicated to service and protection, a calling that many who knew him believed was directly shaped by what he had endured as a child. The story, however, carries a profound and lingering sadness that extends well beyond the crimes of Kenneth Parnell. In September of 1989, Steven Stayner was riding his motorcycle home from his job at a pizza parlor in Merced when he was struck by a car that had pulled into his path. He was thrown from the bike and suffered massive head injuries. Stephen Gregory Stayner died a short time later at a local hospital. He was 24 years old. His death was a devastating blow not only to his own young family and his parents, but also to the people across the country who had come to see him as a symbol of hope rising from the darkest kind of cruelty. The boy who had walked into the Ukiah police station cradling a 5-year-old child, who had defied his captor and reclaimed his own humanity through an act of extraordinary moral clarity, was gone far too soon. Kenneth Parnell, meanwhile, continued to demonstrate that his release from prison had done nothing to alter his predatory impulses. In January 2004, at the age of 72, Parnell was arrested in Berkeley after he attempted to purchase a 4-year-old boy from the child's caregiver for $500. He was charged with multiple felonies under California's 3 strikes law. This time, the courts showed no leniency. In 2005, Parnell was convicted of attempting to buy a child and was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. He would never again walk free. Kenneth Parnell died of natural causes at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville on January 21, 2008. At the age of 76, largely forgotten by the world, his name a footnote to a story whose real legacy was defined not by his depravity, but by the courage of the boy who defied him. Timothy White continued to carry the weight of those 16 days for the rest of his life, but he did so with a quiet strength that echoed the teenager who had lifted him out of the rain and refused to let him go. On April 1, 2010, Timothy White passed away at the age of 35 from a pulmonary embolism, a sudden and unexpected end that left his family and friends reeling. The news of his death prompted an outpouring of tributes from those who had followed the case since that extraordinary March night 3 decades earlier. In the recollections of law enforcement officers, journalists, and family members, the same image surfaced again and again: a 14-year-old boy and a 5-year-old boy emerging from the cold rain of a Mendocino County night, walking through the doors of safety together. The kidnapping of Timothy White and the bravery of Steven Stayner remain one of the most remarkable sequences in American crime history, a case in which the victim of one of the longest unsolved abductions of the era turned himself into the rescuer of a child he had been forced to help steal. The details of the case are matter of public record, studied by psychologists, criminologists, and law enforcement officers as a stark example of the long-term damage done by predators and the unpredictable resilience of the human spirit. There are no perfect endings in cases like this. Only the truth that even in the grip of profound darkness, an ordinary boy made a choice that changed everything for another child. The memory of that choice, made on a wet road in the dead of night, endures as a reminder that courage can surface in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes a single act of conscience can undo years of silence. In the years that followed, the quiet streets of Ukiah and the small neighborhoods of Merced bore the weight of a story that had touched millions, a story that refused to fade from the public consciousness because it was, at its core, not merely about a crime, but about a singular act of moral courage rarely witnessed in the annals of American justice. The city of Ukiah, nestled among the redwoods and vineyards of Mendocino County, remained a place where families knew one another and where the memory of a 5-year-old boy being stolen from his own front yard lingered like a low fog over the collective memory of the community. Law enforcement officers who had worked the case in 1980 would, in retirement, speak to local journalists about the night Steven Stayner walked into the station with Timothy White in his arms, describing it as the single most extraordinary moment of their careers. The house on or Springs Road eventually passed into other hands, its dark history known only to those who had followed the case. A private residence that bore no marker of the horrors that had unfolded inside its walls. For the families at the center of this story, the passage of time brought no simple resolution, only the long, unrelenting work of living with what had happened and with what continued to happen in ways no one could have foreseen. Timothy White returned to his childhood in Ukiah and grew into a young man of quiet determination, shaped indelibly by the 16 days he had spent as a captive and by the 14-year-old boy who had refused to leave him behind. He graduated from Ukiah High School and eventually made the decision to enter law enforcement, a calling that those closest to him understood as a direct response to his own experience. He became a deputy sheriff with the San Bernardino County Sheriff Department, serving in the high desert communities east of Los Angeles, a badge on his chest and a deep, personal knowledge of what it meant to protect the vulnerable. He married a woman named Dina, and together they raised a family, building a life grounded in service and in the quiet refusal to be defined solely by victimhood. His colleagues in the department knew his history and respected him not for the notoriety of his childhood, but for the steady, dependable manner in which he performed his duties day after day. In the White household, the name Steven Stayner was spoken with reverence, and Timothy carried with him always the understanding that he had been given a second chance because a teenager had risked everything to give it to him. Then, on April 1st, 2010, at the age of 35, Timothy David White died suddenly of a pulmonary embolism, leaving behind his wife, his children, and a law enforcement community that mourned him as one of their own. The San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department issued a statement honoring his service and noting his unique place in the history of crime victims who had turned their pain into a commitment to justice. His funeral was attended by family, friends, and officers who had come to regard him as a brother, and the story of his rescue was retold in the eulogies as a testament to the bond between two boys that had never been broken, not by time, not by distance, not by death. In Merced, the Stayner family had already endured a grief that seemed to compound upon itself with a cruelty that defied comprehension. After Steven's triumphant return in 1980, the family had attempted to rebuild, to relearn how to be a family with a son who had been absent for 7 formative years. Delbert and Kay Stayner, Steven's parents, welcomed him home with a love that had never dimmed, and they watched with pride as he tried to carve out a normal life, as he married Jody Edmondson in 1985 and became a father to 2 children. Ashley and Steven Jr., the family lived modestly in Merced, and the media attention gradually subsided, replaced by the ordinary rhythms of school, work, and family dinners. When Steven was killed in the motorcycle accident in September 1989, the grief that swept over the Stayner household was immeasurable, a cruel inversion of the joy that had accompanied his return less than a decade earlier. His funeral drew hundreds of mourners, and the city of Merced, which had celebrated him as a hometown hero, now mourned him as a son lost far too young. A memorial park was established in his name, Steven Stayner Memorial Park on M Street in Merced, a green space where children could play and families could gather, anchored by a bronze plaque that read in part, "In memory of Stephen Gregory Stayner, whose courage and heroism inspired us all." The park became a place of quiet reflection for a community that had followed his story from the moment he vanished to the moment he returned, and it remains to this day a tangible reminder of what one boy did on a rain-soaked night in 1980. But the tragedy of the Stayner family was not yet complete. In 1999, nearly a decade after Steven's death, the nation was horrified by the revelation that his older brother, Cary Stayner, had been arrested for the murders of 4 women in the Yosemite region. Cary, who had been a quiet presence in the family during the years of Steven's disappearance and after his return, was working as a handyman at the Cedar Lodge near Yosemite National Park when he killed Carol Sund, her 15-year-old daughter Julie Sund, and their Argentine exchange student friend Silvina Palazzo in February of that year. Months later, in July 1999, he murdered Yosemite nature guide Joa Armstrong. The investigation that followed uncovered a man whose internal life had been scarred by the same family trauma, though in radically different and ultimately monstrous ways. Cary Stayner confessed to the murders and was convicted in 2002, receiving a sentence of death. He was sent to San Quentin State Prison, where he remains on death row to this day. For Delbert and Kay Stayner, the revelation that their eldest son had committed such unspeakable acts was a devastation that words could scarcely capture. In interviews, Kay Stayner spoke of the unimaginable burden of having lost one son to a predator, only to lose that same son to a traffic accident, and then to discover that another son had himself become a predator of the worst kind. She described a grief so layered and so relentless that it had become the defining feature of her days. Delbert Stayner passed away in 2013 at the age of 79, and Kay Stayner died in 2019 at 79, both of them having carried the weight of a family saga that had unfolded in the full glare of public attention, a story that began with a kidnapping and spiraled into a sequence of events that no novelist would dare invent. The city of Merced, meanwhile, has never forgotten the boy who came home. The memorial park stands as a testament to Steven's courage, and local schools have, from time to time, taught his story as a lesson in resilience and moral decision-making. In Ukiah, the case is recalled by older residents as a moment when the town's innocence was stripped away, yet also as a moment when an unexpected hero emerged from the darkness. The Ukiah Police Department, though it has seen generations of officers come and go, maintains a quiet institutional memory of the night Sergeant Richard Warner took the report from a soaked teenager holding a small child, a moment that remains a high-water mark in the department's long history of service. The families of Timothy White and Steven Stayner, bound together by an experience that no one else can fully understand, have navigated the decades in different ways. The White family, protective of their privacy, has allowed Timothy's legacy to speak through his service as a deputy and through the quiet strength with which he lived his life. His widow Dina and their children have continued to honor his memory privately, and the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department has memorialized him as a deputy who brought a unique perspective to the job, a man who knew exactly what it meant to be saved and who spent his career trying to offer that same salvation to others. The Stayner family, for all the joy of Steven's return and the agony of all that followed, has left behind a complicated and deeply human legacy. The Memorial Park in Merced receives visitors who leave flowers and notes, children who play on the equipment without fully grasping the story behind the name, and adults who pause at the plaque to remember a 14-year-old boy who did something that most adults would lack the courage to do. The broader legacy of the case extends into the way law enforcement agencies across the country approach long-term missing children cases. The Stayner abduction and the subsequent rescue of Timothy White demonstrated with striking clarity that missing children could be held for years, integrated into communities under false identities, and that the public needed to remain vigilant long after the initial headlines faded. The case influenced training protocols and contributed to the growing movement in the 1980s and 1990s to create national databases and rapid response systems for missing children. When the television miniseries I Know My First Name is Steven aired in 1989, just months before Steven's death, it brought the story into millions of American living rooms and cemented the names of Steven Stayner and Timothy White in the national memory. A fictionalized retelling that, for all its dramatic license, captured the essential truth of a boy who refused to let another child suffer as he had suffered. In the end, the kidnapping of Timothy White and the heroism of Steven Stayner endure not as a story with a tidy resolution, but as a narrative of intertwined lives, of a small Northern California city that became the stage for an act of profound decency, and of families who have borne unimaginable sorrow with a dignity that defies easy description. The two boys, one from Merced and one from Ukiah, walked out of the rain together and into a history that would follow them for the rest of their lives and beyond. A reminder that even in the face of the very worst of human nature, a single decision made in the dark of night can ripple outward across decades and across communities, touching hearts and shaping lives in ways that no one could have predicted on that cold March evening when a 14-year-old boy stood in the harsh light of a police station lobby and said, simply and irrevocably, "I brought him back." Before you go, if you found value in this story, please consider hitting subscribe and leaving a like, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next real cold case investigation. We truly appreciate your support. Thanks for listening and watching.